This is my Dwarf II automated astrophotography telescope. It's designed for shooting images of deep space objects like nebula. Now it does have azimuth and elevation tracking built in. I'm not an astrophotographer yet, so if you want a review of this from an astrophotography standpoint, check out YouTube. There's quite a few of them. The consensus seems to be that for $400 it's a pretty good entry-level telescope. I'm going to compare it to my Nikon CoolPix L830 camera. This is a camera that cost about $300 when it came out in 2014. It has a 34x optical zoom. I bought it used on eBay for about $85. So the Dwarf's telephoto lens field of view is very comparable to the Nikon's when it's at its maximum 34x zoom. So if your animal that you're trying to take a picture of is at the appropriate distance or the appropriate size so that field of view is appropriate, then it'll work pretty well. Image quality, I think the Nikon is slightly better. The Nikon has a 16 megapixel image sensor. The Dwarf has a 4K sensor, but if you don't turn off the 2x2 binning, it basically gives you a an HD image output. So the resolution of the Nikon can be a little bit higher. So image quality wise, I think the win goes to the Nikon. Now, a big advantage of the Nikon is that the zoom lens is adjustable, so you can move that field of view in or out appropriate for what you're taking a picture of. Now, the Nikon is manual, so you are the tracking system, whereas with the Dwarf, it can move itself and track objects somewhat automatically. So if you have an object that's relatively slow moving or in a clean background, you can draw a little box around it and the Dwarf will start to track it. And the tracking can work well in certain situations. Here it is tracking a duck, which isn't especially fast moving. You can see that the tracking goes in jerks and it isn't smooth, and you could theoretically smooth this out with some post-processing. It does an okay job if the object goes in front of or behind small obstacles, as you can see it keeping the duck when it goes behind these posts on my dock. However, obviously, if the object goes behind something that completely obscures it, tracking will be lost. And the duck example was probably my best example of automated tracking. I found that I could track a water ski boat, but not the water skiers, some of the time. So here's this tracking a boat relatively well until it suddenly loses tracking and the camera just stays static while the boat continues on. Now this isn't lost due to the boat going behind the tree. That looks different because in that case the camera will follow the boat all the way until it hits the tree and then the camera loses tracking. In this clip I'm tracking the left bird and it sort of follows it flying off for a little while and then incorrectly recovers back to the similar looking bird and does an okay job tracking it up behind the tree. Obviously, in a flock of bird type situation, if one bird goes in front of or behind another bird, it might flip over and track the other bird. And if you get a lot of birds together, things are just going to go kind of wonky. So I have never been successful at tracking a bird in flight. The hardest part is getting the bird in the field of view of the telescope long enough and moving slow enough so that you can highlight it and start tracking. So most of my tracking examples have the bird starting at the ground or on a fence, and I start tracking and then it flies off. And it does an okay job tracking that in some cases. But I think you're really going to have a bird that's pretty far away so that it takes a little while to move through the full field of view. It has to be on a decent background like the sky or the ocean to really be able to track a bird in flight. Now, if you're tracking birds in flight, you do want to make sure you have this guy set up in a shadow so that if the bird were to fly in front of the sun, this guy will not be able to burn out the image sensor by tracking it past the sun. So before I received the Dwarf, I had a picture in my mind of every time I saw a red-shouldered hawk, I could point it at the hawk sitting in a tree and start tracking. And then I could turn on the video recording and walk away. And at some point in the next 20 minutes, when the hawk finally sees something and dives on it, I get a video of this hawk diving down on some poor unsuspecting forest creature. And I just don't think that's going to happen. I'm pretty sure the tracking isn't going to work in that situation. So working the problem from the other direction, here it is tracking a squirrel, and now I'm waiting for something bad to happen to this poor unsuspecting squirrel. The problem is that with orientation changes, the squirrel appearance changes and it loses tracking. So it's really not going to be something where it'll track a squirrel around your lawn for multiple minutes unattended. You're going to have to babysit this thing. It might be slightly better than you holding up your camera and focusing your camera and trying to track a squirrel for 20 minutes because just every so often you have to notice that the tracking has been lost and reattach it to the squirrel. But realistically, I don't think it's going to be much better. Now, I'm recording this in March of 2023. I'm using the firmware version 1.3.22, and because all of this tracking is done in software, there's certainly room for improvement. So Dwarf Labs could update their firmware, and suddenly this guy might track a lot better. So I'm hoping that type of improvement happens in the future. So for tracking wildlife and taking pictures and videos of wildlife, my camera gives slightly better images. It gives me the adjustability of the frame with the zoom lens, and I just don't see the Dwarf really being something I'm going to be using much for that. Now, a big advantage of the Dwarf over the manual handheld camera is that it can be remotely operated. You run it off an app on a phone, or I recommend a large tablet, and it has Wi-Fi, so you can put this guy outside and you can sit inside and operate it. So it could potentially be something where if you had somebody who was bedridden, you could set it up outside for them and let them watch animals outside. But realistically, for the $400 this guy cost, you could probably buy a pretty nice pan-tilt zoom Wi-Fi camera that would do exactly the same thing, maybe even a little bit nicer with that zoom being able to move in and out. Also, the Wi-Fi in this unit is not exceptionally strong. So I've had it working outside, 10 feet away from a window with me sitting inside the window, and that works okay. But I've also had it through a concrete block wall where it won't work. And I've gone outside, I've set this guy up about 90 feet away, like 30 meters, and I'm losing the ability to control it, and the video's getting jerky, direct line of sight, unobstructed, yet 90 feet. So I've heard people online buying Wi-Fi repeaters and putting a Wi-Fi repeater between the telescope and where they're operating it, and that does extend the range. So if you're looking to set this up far away from your house, you're probably going to have to get a Wi-Fi repeater. Now, I've also heard online somebody say that, well, the chip inside can turn the Wi-Fi power up more, and so if they get FCC approval, they could potentially make this guy have better Wi-Fi with the software update. It could happen. I'm not holding out hope for that, but maybe the software, the range on the Wi-Fi will get better over time. So in summary, for $400, I don't think you want to buy this just for daytime use. It's nice to have these daytime use features, but it's really an astrophotography telescope, and you should be buying it for that purpose.